If we would actually see Laurie harassing Joe in the films, do you think we would have this entire debate? Here's another quote from Jimena. I read the book expecting and even looking for some romantic elements in Laurie and Joe scenes, but there was none. In the first book they are best friends and nothing more. It's until the second book that everyone notices Laurie's advances, but Joe asks them not to talk about it because it makes her super uncomfortable. Every time he tries, he hits a wall. Seriously, how did he reach to the conclusion that a proposal was appropriate? Did he even have a ring? Greta portrays Laurie just as the character would have portrayed himself, as the martyr who loved a girl who never loved him back. Laurie is not a martyr. People shouldn't pity him. He ignored Joe's signals once and again. He tried to force her to accept, and even threatened to hurt himself. That is so toxic. But Greta Gerwig does. There is this one group who she says that Joe and Laurie belong together. Then another group who she tells that Joe is gay. And third group who she says that Joe is asexual and never wants to leave her home. And the only thing in common with these groups are her anti-Friedrich statements and racist propaganda of him being German. Here is a quote from blogger My Fanfiction Garden. Gerwig telling one group of people one thing and another something else is the worst thing ever. It is like she's selling herself for money, always changing her opinion. I would also blame the producer or studio for letting her on the loose. I never understood why one should label something for modern audiences instead of being honest to the past and making Friedrich, quote, hot because shallow reasons is anything but right. Too many radical feminists have a, well, let's say, limited understanding of human nature and the world. It is wrong to rewrite history to fit your needs. Louisa had been in love with both Thoreau and Emerson. One shouldn't ignore that. She loved everything German, so saying otherwise is lying. When I started to read Henry Thoreau biographies, there was something that made me 100% convinced that Henry was the real-life Friedrich. It seemed that everyone in Concord had some kind of opinion how Henry looked like. The women who fancied him thought he was handsome. The people who considered him more as an eccentric member of the town thought he looked funny. Some of his friends said that he looked a bit odd when they first met him, but when they got to know him, he started to seem very pleasant. When Friedrich Schiller met Goethe, and Goethe was another model for Friedrich, Schiller wrote that he was a bit disappointed that he didn't look as handsome as he had imagined, but Goethe was such a nice man to be with that he soon forgot his disappointment. In the book When Jo Meets Friedrich for the first time, she does find him attractive. She even positions herself in the nursery so she can stare at him all day long, but the more time she spends with him, in her eyes he becomes more handsome, and Friedrich sees Jo the same way. All romantic interests in Louisa's novels are based on Henry Thoreau in some level. All of them. They have blue eyes, sometimes they have beards, they are tall, they have big hands, big feet, they are solidly built, and they have broad shoulders. Many of these romantic interests also speak with German accents. There is a theory that Louisa May Alcott may have suffered from high-level testosterone production, also known as PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome. All people need testosterone, but with women, high level of testosterone can create physical symptoms. Body appears more muscular than feminine, voice becomes a lot lower, and it can create aggression and mood changes. Louisa has been described with all these symptoms. After her service in the war, Louisa became sick with scarlet fever, and she was treated with mercury, and the mercury treatment was continued through the rest of her life, and it messed up her hormonal balance even more. You would find Henry reading Plato and wondering about the relationship between man and nature. He never seemed to care how he looked, with his white hair, shabby clothes, and scuffed boots. He liked to eat with his fingers. For the smitten Louisa May Alcott, Thoreau's eccentric surface was part of his charm. As she later wrote, beneath the defects the master's eye saw the grand lines that were to serve as the model for the perfect man. Louisa wrote about this into Little Woman. This is the scene where Jo begins to describe Friedrich in her letters. Cast away at the very bottom of the table was the professor, shouting answers to the questions of a very inquisitive, deaf old gentleman on one side, and talking philosophy with a Frenchman on the other. If Amy had been there, she'd have turned her back on him forever, because, sad to relate, he had a great appetite, and shoveled his dinner in a manner which would have horrified, quote, her ladyship. I didn't mind, for I like to see folks eat with relish, as Hannah says. And the poor man must have needed a deal of food after teaching idiots all day. When I was younger, I struggled to understand this scene, which probably means that I was a lot more like Amy than I like to admit, but this is actually a really good way to see that the things that Louisa found attractive, they were not things that most people would pay attention. She even mentions how Amy would turn her head away, but she won't. Jo likes that Friedrich is unconventional, and in a way that unconventionality of her and him is something that bounds them. In Jo's Boys there is a scene where Jo has gained weight, and Friedrich tells her that in his eyes she is still the most beautiful woman in the world. Mercury treatment and the high testosterone could also make a person to gain weight. Greta Gerwig called Friedrich stuffy. Once again, zero mentions of Jo's looks. In the novel, Friedrich is written to be a bit stout, and that it's something that Jo actually finds quite attractive. And pretty much all of Louisa's literal heroes are a bit stout. And there is criticism about skinny guys, that Louisa's sister May liked skinny guys and Louisa liked dad butts. What is so difficult about this for people to understand? I have mentioned this before, but here we go again. A Jo worshipper comes to meet Jo, and then she sees her portrait, and Ted, who is Jo's and Friedrich's son, says that it is a portrait of his mother. And this fan is horrified and doesn't want to meet her since she thinks that Mrs. Bear is a goddamn ugly. All based on Louisa's own experiences with Jo worshippers who were always disappointed when they saw her because they imagined that she would look pretty like Jo. But Jo is not written to be pretty in the book. Looking the way Louisa looked like, it wasn't easy to find love, or somebody who'd say that she was the most beautiful woman in the world. To my experience, there are two types of Alcott schoolers. The Alcott schoolers who make the connection between Louisa's love life and Jo's love life. Then there are Alcott scholars who don't make the connection and also ignore Louisa's love life. And their arguments for hating Friedrich's character, which often is the case, is that they don't think he is handsome, which is very superficial since there is no such thing as universal standard for beauty. This is a quote from Claire Bender's essay, Gender Stereotyping Little Woman. Geraldine Brooks declares, "Another reason Alcott crafted the direction of Jo's life in this way was because she seemed to want to marry but never did. It seems likely, however, that she did have at least two different love interests in her life. Perhaps Alcott decided to give Jo what she herself always wanted, marriage and a family. More likely, Alcott felt encouraged by her father, Bronson, and her publisher to compose a novel that would ultimately please the public. The readers would likely have desired that Jo marry. During that era, most people would agree that spinsterhood was not exactly romantic. Alcott disliked the idea of Jo marrying and vowed that she would make Jo a funny match. In the end, even though Jo married, Alcott got the last laugh by marrying her to an unromantic character. In this case, the scholar mentions that Louisa actually had two love interests, but they refused to make the connection between Louisa's love life and Little Woman, despite the fact that Little Woman is a semi-biographical novel. Once again, the reasoning for Louisa not wanting to marry is, quote, explained her marrying Jo to an non-romantic character. But they don't stop and consider the fact that what Louisa May Alcott saw as romantic is also romantic for Jo. For those of you who don't know, Geraldine Brooks wrote a book called March, a fictional book about Jo's father, and she is absolutely right. Louisa did want to get married and have children, and it seems that she wanted all that with Henry, so why Louisa didn't marry? Henry passed away when Louisa was 28 and he was 44. In Little Woman, Jo and Friedrich marry when Jo is 28 and Friedrich is 44. Even after Henry had passed away, Louisa never gave up hope. She writes about the men she meets in her journals. Louisa wanted to marry for love, but in those times most people married for money. Louisa's sister May had also written to her journal how difficult it was for her to find a partner who would allow them to work outside home. Gerwig said that Laurie is Jo's first feminist ally, and that Laurie wants Jo to step into the adult world. When I got into this point of this interview, I was like, what is this imaginary book that Gerwig has read, since none of that happens in the actual novel? When Laurie proposes Jo, he says that once they marry, she doesn't need to write and she has more important things to do, like to take care of him. He is a man-child. If anything, Jo is the adult in that relationship, and she is frustrated that he is behaving like a young boy even in his early 20s. The person who saves Laurie is Amy because she inspires him to better himself, but that's not in this film or any other films. Here's a quote from Little Woman fan Heatherfield. Gerwig clearly found a different version of the book than the one we read. It is important to consider these books in the context of the period and culture they were written, and unfortunately, it is something that is often forgotten in the adaptations. But how can you understand a story and a character if you don't know the cultural and societal reasons that motivate them? I really hate when people say Jo should have stayed single and enjoyed her life in New York, like they are thinking about Carrie Bradshaw in Sex and the City, and don't think, or don't know, about the weight that being a spinster was for a woman in the 19th century, psychologically and economically. In 1870s, Louisa was making $2 million a year with her children's books, which is a lot of money. What I checked, that is about $21 million today. She was filthy rich, yet in her journals, she never seems to be fully content or happy. Her poor health wasn't cured, and the money could not bring Henry back. Nobody likes to admit that they are lonely, and especially in the 19th century, when the whole idea of romantic love was quite new. Louisa's letter to her friend Maggie Lukens are probably the ones where Louisa is most honest about herself and her feelings. She writes about her belief for reincarnation and receiving her, quote, award in the next life. Louisa May Alcott, the children's friend, presented Louisa, minus the rough edges, as the genteel spinster Aunt Jo. Louisa and her publisher, Thomas Niles, invented the image and built Louisa into a brand. Alcott scholar Daniel Shirley has echoed this style of branding, saying that it was a way to keep Louisa's public image pure. Edna Cheney, who wrote the first Louisa May Alcott biographies, also did this by cutting away stories from Louisa's relationships. For 50 years, Cheney's biography was the only biography available about Louisa, and it shaped the future generations' views about her. In the 19th century, reputation was everything for a woman, and Louisa being in a public position, she was particularly careful about her reputation. Her fling with younger Lady Wisniewski and her love for older men could have caused some troubles if the word got out, and there are times when Louisa seemed to have been ashamed of her position as a spinster. Quote from Jimena. Greta also saw Laurie as the first ally in literature, but then reading the book I was like, am I supposed to like him? He does a lot of great things, very considerate things for Amy especially, but there are other times when he is not a good person and definitely not an ally. I have read about 6 Louisa May Alcott biographies, and they all mention that Louisa fell in love at least once in her life, maybe twice, and these 2 men were Henry Thoreau and Ladislas Wisniewski. Greta Gerwig promotes herself as some kind of Alcott expert, but she obviously ignores these pretty important things about Louisa's character. When a person is a Jo and Laurie shipper, or they have some queer agenda for Jo, they look for information that suits them, even if that information is inaccurate, or something that they know to be a lie. This is known as a confirmation bias. Laurie is partially based on Ladislas Wisniewski, the young Polish composer Louisa met in Switzerland, and she even wrote to her censored diary a chapter called Little Romance with Laddie, which is highly censored. He was 10 years younger than Louisa. When Laurie proposes Jo in the novel, he actually begins to make fun of Friedrich, and Jo gets really angry about that. There's a whole school of Louisa May Alcott researchers who actually believe that it is not about Little Woman. It is actually Louisa rejecting Laddie and choosing to be with Henry. If not in this life, then in the next one. In later letters between Louisa and May, they criticize Laddie's behavior and how immature he is. If Greta Gerwig is a Jo and Laurie shipper, perhaps that is not something she likes to hear. But of course this is something that every person who studies the parallels between Louisa's life and Little Woman should know. And the Little Romance with Laddie, it is pretty much mentioned in every single Louisa May Alcott biography. Alcott scholar John Matheson, who is a Pulitzer Prize winner, he wrote in one of his online publications that Jo rejects young and adventurous Laurie, and Alcott marries Jo to a boring, sexless German professor who forces her to conform into domestic life and prevents her from writing. It was followed by a long rant how Louisa May Alcott didn't care about love or marriage. Before I knew that Madison was a Fritz-phobic, I had read his article about John Surrey, the German soldier who Louisa nursed at the war. John Surrey, he was a tall man with big hands and big feet, brown bushy beard, and he had a very calm temper. That is exactly how Friedrich is described to look like. Isn't that weird that a schooler who writes about real-life Friedrich doesn't make any connections with Little Woman and even makes fun of him being German? And I bet your life, John Madison knows that Louisa May Alcott loved Germany. Here's a quote from Lucy's diary from 1874. She has received letters from her sister May, who has written about her married life. Quote, "Happy letters from May, who is enjoying life as one can but once." Then, with a sudden vision of her own lonely lot, she exclaims, "How different our lives are just now. I so lonely and sick, and she so happy and blessed. She always had the cream of things and deserved it. My time is yet to come somewhere else when I am ready for it." Not only is she incredibly lonely, but she also envies her sister's marital happiness and wishes that she would have a partner. What puzzles me is that this information has been out there for a very long time. These letters are in May Alcott's biography, and it was published in 1920s. Same with these letters between Louisa and Maggie Lukens, where Louisa writes about her loneliness. They have been out there for a very long time. Here is a quote from Little Woman, chapter All Alone. "It is so beautiful to be loved as Laurie loves me. He isn't sentimental, doesn't say much about it, but I see and feel it in all he says and does, and it makes me so happy and so humble that I don't seem to be the same girl I was. I never knew how good and generous and tender he was till now, for he lets me read his heart, and I find it full of noble impulses and hopes and purposes, and I'm so proud to know it's mine. He says he feels as if he could make a prosperous voyage, now with me abroad as mate, and lots of love for ballast. I pray he may, and try to be all he believes me to be, for I love my gallant captain with all my heart and soul and might, and never will desert him, while God lets us to be together. Oh, mother, I never knew how much like heaven this world could be, when two people love and live for one another. And that is our cool, reserved, worldly Amy. Truly, love does work miracles. How very happy they must be." And Jo laid the rustling sheets together with a careful hand, as one might shut the covers of a lovely romance, which holds the reader fast till the end comes, and he finds himself alone in the work-a-day world again. By and by Jo roamed away upstairs, for it was rainy and she could not walk. A restless spirit possessed her, and the odd feeling came again, not bitter as it once was, but a sorrowful patient wonder why one sister should have all she asked, and utter nothing. It was not true, she knew that, and tried to put it away, but the natural craving for affection was strong, and Amy's happiness woke the hungry longing for someone to love with heart and soul and cling to while God let them to be together. Up in the garret, where Jo's unquiet wanderings ended, stood 4 little wooden chests in a row, each mug with its owner's name, and each filled with relics of the childhood and girlhood ended now for all. Jo glanced into them, and when she came to her own, leaned her chin on the edge and stared absently at the chaotic collection, till a bundle of old exercise books caught her eye. She drew them out, turned them over, and relived that pleasant winter at Mrs. Kirk's. She had smiled at first, then she looked thoughtful, next sad, and when she came to a little message written in the professor's hand, her lips began to tremble, the book slid out of her lap, and she sat looking at the friendly words, as they took a new meaning and touched a tender spot in her heart. "Wait for me, my friend. I may be a little late, but I shall surely come. Oh, if he only would! So kind, so good, so patient with me always, my dear old Fritz. I didn't value him half enough when I had him, but now how I should love to see him, for everyone seems to be going away from me, and I am all alone." And holding the little paper fast, as if it were a promise yet to be fulfilled, Jo laid her head down on a comfortable rag bag and cried, as if in opposition to the rain pattering on the roof. Was it all self-pity, loneliness, or low spirits? Or was it the waking up of a sentiment which had abided its time as patiently as it inspired? Who shall say? After reading that letter, how can anyone say that Amy didn't love Laurie? The book was written earlier than May's letter, but as you can see, the feelings that Jo is going through are very similar to Louisa. The way she felt alone reading about her sister being happily married, and as you can see, Jo and Friedrich in the book, they parted as friends. And what the heck was that scene in Greta Gerwig's film of Jo wanting Laurie to take her back? How many Jo and Laurie confirmation biases will be born out of that? Here's another quote from All Alone. There are plenty to love you, so try to be satisfied with father and mother, sisters and brothers, friends and babies, till the best lover of all comes to give you your reward. Mothers are the best lovers in the world, but I don't mind whispering to Mommy that I'd like to try all kinds. It's very curious, but the more I try to satisfy myself with all sorts of natural affections, the more I seem to want. I'd no idea hearts could take in so many. Mine is so elastic, it never seems full now. Those people who say that Jo doesn't want to grow up and just wants to live at home. She says right here in the novel that kind of life where you take care of your mother and your father, it doesn't fulfill her, and it feels very lonely to her. Listen to this. Jo had got so far. She was learning to do her duty and to feel unhappy if she did not, but to do it cheerfully. That was another thing. She had often said she wanted to do something splendid, no matter how hard, and now she had her wish. For what could be more beautiful than to devote her life to father and mother, and if difficulties were necessary to increase the splendor of the effort? What could be harder for a restless, ambitious girl than to give up her own hopes, plans and desires, and cheerfully live for others? The idea of living with her family, it does not satisfy her. She sees it more as a duty. And then you have Greta Gerwig saying certain demographic of the moviegoers that Jo only wanted to live with her family and never grow up, which is BS. And then there are all these other demographics who she's telling a completely different story. I am sure you listeners are starting to understand how deeply intertwined this problem about Friedrich's looks is, and in the end, how silly these excuses are. Louisa was often described as someone who had, quote, masculine air around her. When her fans saw her, they were disappointed by the way she looked like, because they thought she would be young and pretty. Imagine what that makes to a person's self-esteem, and because Louisa looked very masculine, it would not have been that easy for her to find men who considered her attractive. She had lots of male friends, but these younger male friends, they saw her more as a mother than as a partner. Like Laddie Wisniewski, who called her as his, quote, little mama, and he also asked Louisa to call him Vario, which was a nickname that his mother called him. Now, the people who are listening, how many of you would like to be in a relationship with someone who asks you to call them with the nickname that their mother calls them? Maybe not that many. In this interview that I am quoting, it is said that Louise Carrel is also especially welcome as a young, more affable version of the stuffy Professor Bear. Louise Carrel was 36 when he filmed Little Woman. Friedrich in the book is 39. Wow, 3 years. What a way to make Friedrich younger. Greta Gerwig has also been criticized for criticizing Friedrich's age because she is married to a man who is 14 years older than she is, quoting Jimena again. The hypocrisy of the filmmakers is unbelievable. They complain about Bear's looks but ignore the fact that Jo was never superficial and that she herself looked unconventional. Jo's and Friedrich's age difference in the book is 16 years because Henry was 16 years older than Louisa. Jo is 24 in the book when she meets Friedrich and 28 when she marries him. She is a full-grown adult. It is possible to make a Little Woman adaptation and have younger man to play Friedrich without making fun of the characters or his relationship with Jo. 1949 Little Woman does that really well, and Rossano Brassi was 30 when he played Friedrich. Not to mention, this is what Jo says in the novel. Quote, "Don't call yourself old. 40 is the prime of life, and I couldn't help loving you if you were 70. Thank you for listening. This podcast is sponsored by Skillshare. They offer a variety of creative courses from painting to public speaking, photography, writing, and social media skills. You can get a 1 free month if you use my link in the description below. You can find the full episode how Greta Gerwig lied about, well, everything, Little Woman and adaptive attractiveness, from the end screen, and link is also in the description. You can listen Little Woman podcast on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and all major podcast platforms. Take care and make good choices. Bye!